Picture this: a woman so powerful that she commanded the loyalty of two of Rome's greatest generals, so intelligent that she spoke 9 languages fluently, and so wealthy that she once dissolved a pearl worth millions in wine just to prove a point. Yet despite all this, her name has been reduced to nothing more than a Hollywood stereotype of seduction and beauty. The real Cleopatra VII was far more complex, far more brilliant, and far more tragic than any movie could ever capture. This is the story of the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who nearly changed the course of Western civilization and whose fall marked the end of an era that had lasted for 3,000 years. Before we dive into this incredible tale of power, politics, and passion, if you're enjoying stories about history's most fascinating figures, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. We're constantly uncovering the real stories behind the legends, and your support helps us bring these amazing historical narratives to life. The year was 69 BCE, and the ancient world was on the brink of transformation. In Egypt, the last great Hellenistic kingdom was struggling to maintain its independence as Rome's shadow grew ever longer across the Mediterranean. Into this world of political intrigue and cultural upheaval was born Cleopatra VII Philopator, a name that would echo through history long after the civilization that created it had crumbled to dust. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic Dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries since Alexander the Great's conquest. The Ptolemies were notorious for their sibling marriages, a practice designed to keep power within the family, but which often led to bitter civil wars and political instability. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had spent much of his reign fighting to maintain his throne against rebellious subjects and ambitious relatives, often relying on Roman support to stay in power. From birth, Cleopatra was immersed in a world where survival meant mastering the deadly art of politics. The Ptolemaic court was a viper's nest of competing ambitions, where brothers murdered sisters, children betrayed parents, and loyalty was a luxury few could afford. Yet it was also a center of learning and culture, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, and a meeting point for the greatest minds of the ancient world. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond her palace walls. While other Ptolemaic rulers had remained insular, speaking only Greek, and viewing their Egyptian subjects as little more than sources of revenue, Cleopatra made the revolutionary decision to learn the native language. She was reportedly the first Ptolemaic pharaoh in 300 years to speak Egyptian, a choice that would prove crucial to her later success. But language was just the beginning of her intellectual pursuits. Ancient sources credit her with fluency in 9 languages, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin. She studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and literature, transforming herself into one of the most educated people of her time. This wasn't mere academic curiosity. It was strategic preparation for the challenges she knew lay ahead. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, 18-year-old Cleopatra found herself thrust into power alongside her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she was expected to marry according to Ptolemaic custom. The arrangement was typical of Egyptian royal succession, designed to ensure continuity and prevent civil war. However, Cleopatra had no intention of being a mere figurehead, while her brother's advisors wielded the real power. The early years of her reign were marked by a series of crises that would have broken a lesser ruler. Egypt was suffering from poor Nile floods, leading to famine and economic hardship. The kingdom's finances were strained by decades of tribute payments to Rome, and the population was restless. Making matters worse, Ptolemy XIII's advisors led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achillas, were actively working to marginalize Cleopatra and seize control of the government. The conflict between the siblings quickly escalated into open warfare. By 48 BCE, Cleopatra had been forced to flee Egypt, gathering an army in Syria to reclaim her throne. It was at this crucial moment that fate intervened in the form of Julius Caesar, the Roman general who was pursuing his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean following their decisive battle at Pharsalus. When Pompey arrived in Egypt seeking sanctuary, Ptolemy XIII's advisors made a fatal miscalculation. Believing that Caesar would be grateful if they eliminated his enemy, they murdered Pompey as he stepped ashore. Instead of gratitude, Caesar was horrified by this act of treachery against a fellow Roman. When he arrived in Alexandria shortly afterward, he was already predisposed to distrust Ptolemy XIII's government. Cleopatra, demonstrating the intelligence and audacity that would define her reign, saw this as her opportunity. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet, though the reality was probably less dramatic, but no less clever. What matters is that she managed to reach Caesar before her brother's advisors could present their version of events. And in that meeting, she began to weave the web of alliance that would define the rest of her life. The attraction between Caesar and Cleopatra was immediate and mutual, but to dismiss it as mere physical desire would be to misunderstand both participants. Caesar was 52 years old, a seasoned politician and general who had seen everything the world had to offer. He was not easily impressed by beauty alone. What captured his attention was Cleopatra's intelligence, her political acumen, and her vision for Egypt's future. For Cleopatra, Caesar represented not just personal salvation, but the key to Egypt's survival as an independent kingdom. She understood that the age of small, independent states was ending, that the future belonged to vast empires, and that Egypt's only hope lay in a partnership with Rome rather than subjugation to it. In Caesar, she saw a man who shared her grand vision and possessed the power to make it reality. Their affair scandalized the ancient world, but their political partnership was even more significant. Caesar threw his support behind Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and together they waged war against Ptolemy XIII and his advisors. The conflict was fierce and brutal, culminating in the siege of Alexandria, during which parts of the great library were destroyed by fire, a loss that scholars still mourn today. When Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, whether by accident or design, Cleopatra's victory was complete. She was now the undisputed ruler of Egypt, but her success had come at a price. She was now inextricably linked to Caesar, and by extension to Rome's internal politics. This connection would define the rest of her reign and ultimately seal her fate. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra deepened beyond politics into genuine partnership, and most believe love. In 47 BCE, she bore him a son, Caesarion, whose very existence was a bold statement about her ambitions. By naming the child Little Caesar, she was making it clear that she saw herself and her son as Caesar's legitimate heirs, not just in Egypt, but potentially in Rome itself. Together, Caesar and Cleopatra embarked on a cruise up the Nile, a journey that was part honeymoon, part political theater, and part strategic planning session. For Caesar, it was an opportunity to see the wealth and wonders of Egypt firsthand, to understand the source of the kingdom's power and potential. For Cleopatra, it was a chance to show her Roman ally the full extent of her realm and to demonstrate her mastery over the ancient land. The cruise was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury, Ancient sources describe a floating palace complete with gardens, libraries, and quarters for hundreds of servants and guards. They sailed past temples and monuments that were already ancient when Caesar was born, through landscapes that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties stretching back to the dawn of recorded history. For Caesar, accustomed to the relatively young civilization of Rome, it must have been a humbling reminder of Egypt's antiquity and cultural richness. When Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE, he brought Cleopatra with him, installing her in a villa across the Tiber River. This was an audacious move that shocked Roman society. No foreign queen had ever been given such prominence in the heart of the empire, and Cleopatra's presence was seen as a direct challenge to Roman values and traditions. Conservative senators viewed her as a corrupting influence on their great general, a foreign witch who threatened to turn Caesar into an Oriental despot. But Cleopatra was undeterred by Roman hostility. She understood that her future and Egypt's independence depended on securing Caesar's position and advancing their shared vision of a new kind of empire. She established herself as a patron of Roman intellectuals and artists, winning over influential voices through her wit, learning, and generosity. She also began positioning herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, a role that resonated powerfully with the growing Egyptian religious influence in Rome. The golden age of their partnership seemed destined to last forever. Caesar was at the height of his power, having been declared dictator for life, and plans were underway for a great eastern campaign that would have taken him and Cleopatra to conquer Parthia and perhaps even India. Their son Caesarion was growing up bilingual and bicultural, educated in both Roman and Egyptian traditions, a living symbol of the fusion they hoped to achieve. Then came the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Caesar's assassination by a group of Republican conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, shattered Cleopatra's world in an instant. The man who had been her partner, protector, and pathway to greatness lay dead on the Senate floor, and with him died her dreams of a Roman-Egyptian empire stretching from Britain to India. Cleopatra's position in Rome became untenable overnight. The conspirators who had killed Caesar viewed her as a symbol of everything they opposed about his rule. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and closest friend, was consumed with grief and rage, hardly in a position to protect her. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was an 18-year-old boy of unknown capabilities and intentions. Cleopatra had no choice but to flee Rome, returning to Egypt with her son and whatever allies she could muster. The journey back to Alexandria must have been one of the darkest periods of her life. Everything she had worked for seemed to be crumbling. Egypt was once again isolated and vulnerable, surrounded by Roman civil war and facing an uncertain future. But Cleopatra was not one to surrender to despair. If Caesar was gone, she would find another way to secure Egypt's independence and her own power. The Roman world was now divided between Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, and his avengers, led by Mark Antony and Octavian. Both sides sought Egypt's support, or at least its neutrality, recognizing the kingdom's wealth and strategic importance. Cleopatra played a careful game, providing minimal support to both sides while strengthening her own position. When Antony and Octavian defeated the conspirators at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, Cleopatra found herself facing a new political reality. The Roman world was now divided between the two victors, with Antony controlling the east and Octavian the west. For Egypt, this meant dealing primarily with Antony, who had established himself in Athens and was demanding tribute and support from all Eastern kingdoms. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in 41 BCE, and once again, she prepared to stake everything on a single encounter with a Roman strongman. But this time, she was no longer the desperate 18-year-old who had smuggled herself to Caesar in a carpet. She was now a mature queen of 28, with 8 years of absolute rule behind her and hard-won wisdom about the ways of power. The meeting at Tarsus became one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, though like much of Cleopatra's story, it has been obscured by centuries of romantic embellishment. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra arrived dressed as Aphrodite, sailing up the river Cydnus in a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. The staging was magnificent, designed to overwhelm Antony's senses and establish her as his equal rather than his supplicant. But beneath the theatrical display lay serious political calculation. Cleopatra understood that Antony, unlike Caesar, was more susceptible to flattery and display, more impressed by luxury and spectacle. She also recognized that he was under enormous pressure to fund his planned invasion of Parthia, and would be especially receptive to Egypt's wealth and resources. The chemistry between them was immediate and intense, but their relationship was fundamentally different from her partnership with Caesar. Where Caesar had been her intellectual equal and political mentor, Antony was more of a kindred spirit, sharing her love of luxury, her appreciation for grand gestures, and her belief in the divine nature of kingship. He was also, crucially, in a weaker position than Caesar had been, more dependent on her support, and therefore more willing to treat her as an equal partner. Their affair began in Alexandria, where Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in unprecedented luxury. Together, they founded a dining club called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure and the celebration of their partnership. But even their most extravagant parties were political events, designed to demonstrate their wealth and power to potential allies and enemies alike. The relationship produced 3 children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene in 40 BCE, and Ptolemy Philadelphus in 36 BCE. These children were not just personal bonds between the lovers, but political statements about their shared vision of the future. Their names invoked both Alexander the Great and traditional Ptolemaic titles, suggesting a new dynasty that would unite East and West under their rule. However, Antony's position in the Roman world remained precarious. He was still married to Octavian's sister Octavia, a union designed to cement the alliance between the two triumvirs. His relationship with Cleopatra, while politically useful, was also a source of scandal and criticism in Rome, where it was seen as evidence of his corruption by Eastern luxury and foreign influence. The partnership between Antony and Cleopatra reached its zenith with the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, a ceremony that effectively announced their intention to create a new Eastern empire. In a spectacular display staged in the heart of Alexandria, Antony formally granted vast territories to Cleopatra and their children, while she appeared dressed as Isis, the goddess who was increasingly identified with her rule. Caesarion was proclaimed the legitimate son of Julius Caesar and heir to his legacy, a direct challenge to Octavian's position. Alexander Helios was named king of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, territories that Antony planned to conquer. Cleopatra Selene became queen of Cyrenaica and Libya, while the infant Ptolemy Philadelphus was granted Syria and Cilicia. Cleopatra herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings, ruling over this vast theoretical empire as Antony's equal partner. The ceremony was magnificent theater, but it was also a declaration of war against the Roman establishment. By asserting Caesarion's legitimacy, Cleopatra was challenging Octavian's claim to be Caesar's true heir. By accepting kingdoms that had not yet been conquered, the couple was announcing their intention to remake the map of the known world. Octavian, now calling himself Caesar Augustus, understood the challenge immediately. He had spent years carefully building his position in Rome, presenting himself as the defender of traditional Roman values against Eastern corruption. The donations of Alexandria gave him the perfect propaganda tool, allowing him to portray Antony as a traitor who had abandoned his Roman identity for foreign luxury and power. The propaganda war that followed was as vicious as anything in modern politics. Octavian portrayed Cleopatra as a foreign witch who had corrupted Antony with magic and sexual manipulation, turning him against his own people and traditions. He emphasized her foreign birth, her worship of animal-headed gods, and her supposed plan to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. Every aspect of her personality and rule was twisted into evidence of her unfitness to influence Roman affairs. For her part, Cleopatra fought back through her own propaganda campaign, presenting herself as the heir to Alexander the Great and the legitimate ruler of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. She emphasized her role as the goddess Isis, protector of sailors and mother of kings, and portrayed Antony as the god Dionysus, her divine consort in a sacred union that transcended mere politics. The propaganda war masked a deeper struggle over the future of the Mediterranean world. Would it be unified under a single Roman emperor ruling from Italy? Or would it become a collection of allied kingdoms governed by divine monarchs in the Eastern tradition? Would Roman law and customs dominate, or would the empire become a synthesis of East and West, incorporating the wisdom and traditions of all its peoples? By 32 BCE, both sides were preparing for the final confrontation. Octavian had consolidated his control over the western provinces and was building a massive fleet to challenge Antony's eastern forces. Antony and Cleopatra, meanwhile, were gathering their own naval forces and armies, drawing on the resources of Egypt and their allied kingdoms to match Octavian's preparations. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BCE. The battle was fought off the western coast of Greece, where Octavian's fleet faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra in what would determine the future of the known world. The engagement was massive, involving hundreds of warships and tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers. The details of the battle remain controversial, complicated by the propaganda of the victors and the natural confusion of such a large-scale naval engagement. What is clear is that at a crucial moment, Cleopatra's flagship broke away from the battle and sailed south toward Egypt. With Antony following in a smaller vessel, their remaining forces, demoralized by the apparent abandonment, soon surrendered to Octavian. The traditional narrative, promoted by Octavian and accepted by many ancient historians, portrays this as cowardice or betrayal, with Cleopatra fleeing at the first sign of danger and Antony abandoning his duty to follow her. But modern historians have suggested alternative explanations. The battle may have been going badly from the start, with Cleopatra's withdrawal representing a strategic decision to preserve their forces for a continued struggle from Egypt. Alternatively, the whole engagement may have been intended as a fighting retreat, designed to get their treasury and remaining forces safely back to Alexandria. Whatever the truth about Actium, its consequences were clear. Antony and Cleopatra had lost their bid to reshape the Roman world, and Octavian was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Their dream of an Eastern empire was over, but they were not yet ready to surrender. Instead, they returned to Egypt to prepare for a final siege, hoping either to negotiate acceptable terms or to make their last stand so costly that Octavian would be forced to compromise. The year between Actium and Octavian's arrival in Egypt was a strange twilight period for the couple. They continued to live in luxury, founding a new society called the Order of the Inseparable in Death, a grim evolution of their earlier pleasure-seeking club. They began preparing elaborate tombs, stockpiling poison, and making arrangements for their children's futures, all while maintaining the fiction that they might yet prevail. Cleopatra, in particular, seemed to be exploring every possible option for survival. She opened negotiations with Octavian, offering to abdicate in favor of her children if they would be allowed to rule Egypt as Roman clients. She also reportedly tested various poisons on condemned criminals, searching for the most painless method of suicide should it become necessary. At the same time, she was moving her treasure to her tomb complex, possibly planning to threaten its destruction if Octavian's terms were unacceptable. Antony, meanwhile, seemed to be sinking into despair and self-pity. He had lost everything that had defined his identity, his position in Rome, his military reputation, his dreams of conquest, and his self-respect. He spent his time drinking heavily, raging against his fate, and occasionally rousing himself to futile gestures of defiance. When Octavian finally arrived in Egypt in 30 BCE, the end came quickly. Antony's remaining forces deserted him, his fleet surrendered without a fight, and Alexandria opened its gates to the conqueror. Faced with the complete collapse of his position, Antony fell on his sword, though he botched even this final act, taking hours to die from his self-inflicted wounds. Cleopatra's final days remain shrouded in mystery and legend. After Antony's death, she was captured by Octavian's forces and held under house arrest while he decided her fate. The new master of Rome was in a difficult position. He wanted to parade her through Rome as his captive, a living symbol of his victory over the East. But he also recognized that keeping her alive was dangerous. As long as she lived, she remained a focus for Egyptian nationalism and Eastern resistance. The negotiations between Octavian and Cleopatra during this period must have been fascinating, though we have only fragments of information about them. She was fighting for her life and the future of her children, while he was trying to extract maximum propaganda value from her defeat without creating a martyr. She had one final card to play: her vast treasure hidden in her tomb complex and rigged with fire traps that could destroy it if she were killed. According to the traditional account, Cleopatra chose suicide rather than the humiliation of being paraded through Rome. On August 12th, 30 BCE, she dismissed her servants, dressed herself in her royal regalia, and allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, a cobra sacred to Egyptian royalty. She died quickly, her servants Iris and Charmian dying beside her from the same poison. The image of Cleopatra's death by snakebite has dominated popular imagination for over 2,000 years, but modern scholars question its accuracy. The logistics of smuggling a deadly snake past Roman guards seem improbable, and the symptoms described don't match those of cobra venom. More likely, she used a fast-acting poison, possibly hidden in a hairpin or cosmetic container, that allowed her to die quickly and relatively painlessly. Whatever the method, her death was a final act of defiance against Roman conquest. By choosing the manner and timing of her end, she denied Octavian his greatest prize and transformed her defeat into a kind of victory. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, maintaining her dignity and royal status to the very end. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end, after 275 years of rule, Egypt became a Roman province, its vast wealth flowing to Rome to fund Octavian's transformation into Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The age of the independent Hellenistic kingdoms was over, and the Mediterranean world would remain under Roman and later Byzantine control for the next 6 centuries. The fate of Cleopatra's children reflects the ruthless pragmatism of Roman politics. Caesarion, as the supposed son of Julius Caesar, was seen as too dangerous to live and was executed shortly after his mother's death. The 3 children she had with Antony were taken to Rome, where they were raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman widow. Alexander Helios disappears from the historical record, probably dying young, while Ptolemy Philadelphus may have lived to adulthood but never achieved any position of importance. Only Cleopatra Selene thrived, eventually marrying Juba II of Numidia and becoming Queen of Mauritania, where she preserved something of her mother's legacy. But Cleopatra's true legacy lay not in her children, but in the legend that grew up around her life and death. Even as Octavian's propaganda machine worked to portray her as a foreign seductress who had corrupted noble Romans, other voices began to tell a different story. Writers like Plutarch, though writing under Roman rule, portrayed her as an intelligent and capable ruler who had almost succeeded in creating a new kind of empire. The real tragedy of Cleopatra's story was not her death, but the lost opportunity she represented. In her vision of a Mediterranean world governed by a partnership between Rome and Egypt, East and West, she offered an alternative to the purely Roman Empire that actually emerged. Her Egypt was not a backward kingdom to be exploited, but a sophisticated civilization with its own contributions to make to the common culture. She understood, as few of her contemporaries did, that the future belonged to whoever could successfully combine Roman military and administrative efficiency with the wealth and cultural richness of the Eastern kingdoms. Her partnership with Caesar, and later with Antony, represented attempts to create this synthesis, to build an empire that would be more than the sum of its parts. The failure of her vision had consequences that lasted for centuries. The Roman Empire that emerged from the civil wars was magnificent, but also brittle, dependent on constant expansion and exploitation to maintain itself. It never successfully integrated its eastern and western halves, eventually splitting into separate entities that competed with each other as much as with external enemies. One wonders what might have happened if Cleopatra's model of partnership and synthesis had prevailed instead. Her personal qualities were equally remarkable. In an age when women rarely held real power, she ruled one of the world's greatest kingdoms for nearly 2 decades. She was a patron of learning who maintained Alexandria's position as the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. She was a skilled diplomat who navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics with remarkable success for most of her career. She was a military leader who personally led her forces in battle and an administrator who managed Egypt's complex economy and social system. Most remarkably, she was a cultural bridge between the Greek, Egyptian, and Roman worlds. Unlike her Ptolemaic predecessors, who had remained isolated in their Greek-speaking court, she embraced all aspects of her kingdom's heritage. She spoke Egyptian and participated in traditional religious rituals. She presented herself as the reincarnation of Isis, while also appealing to Roman ideals of leadership and partnership. She was equally at home discussing philosophy with Alexandrian scholars and planning military campaigns with Roman generals. The propaganda that surrounded her both during her lifetime and after her death has obscured these achievements, reducing one of history's most capable rulers to a simple story of feminine wiles and sexual manipulation. This interpretation says more about the prejudices of her enemies and later historians than about Cleopatra herself. The idea that she could have commanded the loyalty of brilliant men like Caesar and Antony through seduction alone ignores the political and military realities of her situation. Caesar and Antony were both experienced, cynical politicians who had seen everything the ancient world had to offer. They were not naive young men who could be easily manipulated by a pretty face. Their partnerships with Cleopatra were based on mutual benefit and shared vision, not romantic infatuation. She offered them access to Egypt's wealth and strategic position, while they provided her with the military protection she needed to maintain her independence. The sexual dimension of these relationships was certainly real, but it was also politically motivated. Marriage and sexual partnership were tools of diplomacy in the ancient world, ways of cementing alliances and creating bonds between ruling families. Cleopatra's affairs with Caesar and Antony were no different from the dynastic marriages that had been used to maintain the balance of power for centuries. What made her relationships different was the equality she demanded and often achieved. She was not content to be a junior partner or a decorative consort, but insisted on being treated as a co-ruler and equal ally. This was virtually unprecedented in the male-dominated world of ancient politics, and helps explain why her enemies found her so threatening. The cultural impact of her story has been enormous, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and entertainment over the past 2 millennia. From Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to Hollywood blockbusters, her story has been told and retold, each generation finding new meanings and interpretations in her rise and fall. But these retellings have also contributed to the myths that surround her, emphasizing romance and tragedy at the expense of politics and achievement. The real Cleopatra was far more interesting than the seductress of popular imagination. She was a brilliant politician who nearly changed the course of world history, a capable ruler who maintained Egypt's independence for 2 decades against impossible odds, and a visionary who saw the potential for a different kind of empire based on partnership rather than domination. Her failure was not a result of personal weakness or moral corruption, but of the harsh realities of ancient politics. She was playing a game where the stakes were survival itself, where a single mistake could mean death or exile, where today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy without warning. That she played this game successfully for as long as she did is a tribute to her intelligence and skill. In the end, Cleopatra's story is one of what might have been. She represented a path not taken, a different way of organizing the ancient world that might have led to a more stable and inclusive empire. Her vision of East-West partnership, of cultural synthesis and mutual respect, was centuries ahead of its time. When the Roman Empire finally did split into eastern and western halves, it was along lines that she had anticipated, but by then the opportunity for her kind of synthesis had long passed. Her death marked the end of an era in more ways than one. She was the last of the great Hellenistic monarchs, the final heir to the empire of Alexander the Great. With her passing, the age of independent Greek kingdoms came to an end, and the Mediterranean world entered a new phase dominated by Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture. But she was also, in many ways, ahead of her time, anticipating developments that would not come to fruition for centuries. Her vision of a multicultural empire, her understanding of the importance of cultural synthesis, her recognition that the future belonged to whoever could successfully combine different traditions and strengths, all point toward the kind of cosmopolitan civilization that would emerge much later in history. The tragedy of Cleopatra is not just personal, but historical. In her defeat, the ancient world lost one of its most innovative and forward-thinking leaders, someone who might have guided the transition from the age of city-states and kingdoms to the age of empires along different lines. Instead of the rigid hierarchies and cultural uniformity that characterized the Roman Empire at its height, we might have seen a more flexible and diverse civilization that drew strength from its variety rather than seeing it as a weakness. Her legacy reminds us that history is not inevitable, that the paths taken by human civilization are the result of countless individual choices and accidents of fate. A different outcome at Actium, a successful negotiation with Octavian, a longer life for Julius Caesar, any of these might have changed everything. The world we know today might have developed along entirely different lines if Cleopatra's vision had prevailed. In our own time, when questions of cultural identity, political partnership, and the balance between unity and diversity are as relevant as ever, Cleopatra's story offers both inspiration and warning. Her achievements show what is possible when brilliant individuals refuse to accept the limitations of their time and work to create something new. Her defeat reminds us of the fragility of such visions and the importance of the choices we make in shaping the future. The last pharaoh of Egypt died over 2,000 years ago, but her story continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental questions about power, identity, and the possibilities of human civilization. She remains one of history's most fascinating figures, not because of her romantic entanglements or her dramatic death, but because of her intelligence, her ambition, and her vision of what the ancient world might have become under different circumstances. The immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world that would reverberate for generations. As news of her suicide spread from Alexandria to Rome, from Athens to Jerusalem, people struggled to comprehend that an era spanning 3 centuries had come to an end. The woman who had dined with Julius Caesar, who had commanded fleets at Actium, who had spoken as an equal to the most powerful men of her age, was gone, and with her died the last vestige of Alexander the Great's empire. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, faced the immediate challenge of consolidating his victory while managing the vast wealth and complex administration of Egypt. The kingdom he had inherited was unlike any other Roman province. Egypt was not simply a conquered territory to be plundered and abandoned, but a sophisticated civilization with intricate systems of agriculture, taxation, and religious observance that had evolved over millennia. The yearly flooding of the Nile, the management of irrigation canals, the collection of grain taxes, the supervision of temples, all required knowledge and expertise that Roman administrators simply did not possess. The new master of the Mediterranean world quickly realized that ruling Egypt would require a fundamentally different approach from governing other provinces. The land was too valuable and too complex to be treated as ordinary conquered territory. Instead, Augustus established Egypt as his personal domain, governed not by the Senate, but directly by the emperor through appointed prefects. This decision would have profound consequences for both Rome and Egypt, creating a precedent for imperial autocracy that would shape the Roman Empire for centuries to come. But the Roman absorption of Egypt was not simply an administrative matter. It represented the collision of 2 fundamentally different worldviews, 2 distinct approaches to civilization and governance. Roman culture emphasized law, order, military discipline, and civic duty. Egyptian culture, despite 3 centuries of Greek rule, remained deeply rooted in concepts of divine kingship, cosmic harmony, and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The merger of these traditions would create tensions and syntheses that influenced everything from Roman religion to imperial ideology. The wealth that flowed from Egypt to Rome following Cleopatra's defeat was staggering. Ancient sources suggest that the treasure Octavian seized from Alexandria was so vast that it ended a currency shortage that had plagued the Roman world for decades. Interest rates in Rome reportedly dropped from 12% to 4% overnight as Egyptian gold flooded the market. This influx of wealth allowed Augustus to undertake massive building projects, to establish the Praetorian Guard, to create a professional army with regular pay, and to implement the social programs that would secure his popularity with the Roman people. Yet this wealth came at a cost that would only become apparent over time. By making Egypt the personal treasury of the emperor, Augustus created a dangerous precedent. Future emperors would come to see Egypt not as a province to be developed and integrated into the empire, but as a source of revenue to fund their ambitions and extravagances. This extractive relationship would gradually weaken Egypt's economy and undermine the very systems that had made the kingdom so prosperous under Ptolemaic rule. The cultural impact of Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire was equally significant. Egyptian religion, with its promise of personal salvation and eternal life, began to spread throughout the Mediterranean world with unprecedented speed. The cult of Isis, with which Cleopatra had so closely identified herself, became one of the most popular mystery religions in the Roman Empire. Temples to Egyptian gods appeared in cities from Britain to Syria, carrying with them ideas and practices that would eventually influence the development of Christianity itself. The irony was profound. Cleopatra had been defeated militarily and politically, but her cultural and religious legacy was conquering the empire that had destroyed her. Roman matrons wore Egyptian jewelry and cosmetics. Roman architects incorporated Egyptian motifs into their buildings. Roman writers studied Egyptian literature and philosophy. The very civilization that Augustus had supposedly saved from Eastern corruption was being transformed by Eastern influences more thoroughly than ever before. This cultural synthesis was most visible in the city of Alexandria itself, which continued to thrive under Roman rule despite the trauma of conquest. The Great Library, though diminished from its peak, remained the premier center of learning in the ancient world. The museum continued to attract scholars and scientists from across the empire. The city's merchants and bankers adapted to new political realities while maintaining their commercial networks stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. But Alexandria under Roman rule was a different place from the cosmopolitan capital that Cleopatra had known. The city's Greek elite, who had supported the Ptolemies for 3 centuries, found themselves caught between their traditional Egyptian subjects and their new Roman masters. The delicate balance that had allowed Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews to coexist in relative harmony began to break down as Roman administrators imposed new hierarchies and classifications that hardened ethnic and religious divisions. The transformation of Egypt's agricultural system under Roman rule provides a particularly clear example of how conquest changed the fundamental nature of Egyptian society. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt's farmers had been highly regulated but relatively prosperous, protected by royal decrees that limited rent increases and provided relief during bad harvest years. The Roman administration, focused primarily on maximizing tax revenue, gradually eroded these protections, treating Egyptian farmers as little more than sources of grain for the Roman market. The consequences were predictable and tragic. Agricultural productivity, which had remained stable or even increased under Ptolemaic rule, began a long decline that would continue for centuries. Rural communities, that had maintained their traditional structures and customs for millennia found themselves disrupted by Roman demands for cash taxes rather than payment in kind. The careful balance between human needs and environmental limitations that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years was gradually destroyed in the pursuit of short-term profit. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the memory of Cleopatra was being systematically reshaped to serve Augustus's political needs. The official version of her story, promoted through art, literature, and public monuments, portrayed her as the embodiment of Eastern decadence and corruption, a foreign seductress who had nearly destroyed the Roman Republic through her manipulation of noble Roman men. This propaganda was so successful that it has influenced popular perceptions of Cleopatra to this day. Yet even this hostile portrait could not entirely suppress recognition of her extraordinary capabilities. Augustan poets like Horace and Propertius, while dutifully celebrating her defeat, could not help acknowledging her courage, intelligence, and regal bearing. Their descriptions of her final moments, facing death with dignity and determination, created an image that transcended imperial propaganda and contributed to her lasting fame. The persistence of Cleopatra's legend, despite systematic attempts to diminish it, speaks to something fundamental about her historical significance. She represented not just the end of Ptolemaic Egypt, but the road not taken by ancient civilization. Her vision of a Mediterranean world governed by partnership rather than domination, by cultural synthesis rather than Roman hegemony, offered an alternative model that continued to haunt the imperial imagination long after her death. This alternative vision becomes even more poignant when we consider the long-term trajectory of the Roman Empire. The purely Roman model of governance that triumphed with Augustus proved remarkably successful for several centuries, creating unprecedented peace and prosperity across the Mediterranean world. But it also contained the seeds of its own destruction, the empire's inability to successfully integrate its diverse populations, its dependence on constant expansion and exploitation, its failure to develop sustainable economic and political institutions. All these weaknesses might have been addressed by the kind of flexible, multicultural approach that Cleopatra had advocated. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, which eventually became the Byzantine Empire, did eventually evolve in directions that Cleopatra might have recognized and approved. Byzantine civilization successfully combined Roman administrative efficiency with Greek intellectual traditions and Christian religious insights. It maintained its independence for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, suggesting that the synthesis Cleopatra had envisioned was not only possible, but potentially more durable than pure Roman rule. The question of what might have happened if Cleopatra had succeeded haunts historians and historical novelists to this day. Would a Roman-Egyptian partnership have been more successful in integrating the diverse peoples of the Mediterranean world? Would the combination of Roman military organization with Egyptian wealth and Eastern cultural traditions have created a more stable and enduring civilization? Would the transition from ancient to medieval world have taken different forms if Cleopatra's vision had prevailed? These questions become even more intriguing when we consider the technological and scientific developments that were beginning to emerge in the Hellenistic world during Cleopatra's lifetime. Alexandria remained the center of ancient science and engineering, home to innovations in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and mechanical engineering that would not be surpassed for centuries. The steam engine had been invented by Hero of Alexandria during the 1st century CE. Sophisticated astronomical instruments allowed precise calculation of planetary movements. Medical knowledge had advanced to the point where successful surgical procedures were routine. Under different political circumstances, these innovations might have developed more rapidly and spread more widely. The Roman Empire, for all its administrative efficiency, was not particularly interested in technological development. Roman engineering focused primarily on practical applications like roads, aqueducts, and military equipment. The theoretical sciences that flourished in Alexandria were seen as interesting curiosities rather than practical tools for improving society. Cleopatra, with her love of learning and her appreciation for Alexandria's intellectual traditions, might have provided the kind of royal patronage that could have accelerated scientific and technological development. Her partnerships with Caesar and Antony had already demonstrated her ability to combine practical politics with intellectual curiosity. Given time and success, she might have created the conditions for a scientific revolution 15 centuries before it actually occurred in Europe. The religious dimensions of Cleopatra's legacy are equally fascinating to contemplate. Her identification with Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing, connected her to religious traditions that were already spreading throughout the Roman world. Isis worship emphasized personal salvation, the promise of eternal life, and the divine nature of feminine power, themes that would later be incorporated into Christian theology. Some scholars have suggested that Cleopatra's presentation of herself as a living goddess influenced early Christian concepts of divine incarnation. The idea that a deity could take human form and live among mortals was not new to the ancient world, but Cleopatra's specific combination of political authority and religious identity may have provided a model that influenced later religious developments. The survival and spread of Egyptian religious ideas throughout the Roman Empire also preserved knowledge and practices that might otherwise have been lost. Egyptian temples continued to function under Roman rule, maintaining libraries and schools that preserved ancient wisdom. The gradual translation of Egyptian texts into Greek and Latin made this knowledge available to a wider audience, contributing to the intellectual ferment that would eventually produce Christianity, Neoplatonism, and other philosophical and religious movements. The economic consequences of Cleopatra's defeat extended far beyond Egypt itself. Her vision of a Mediterranean economy based on trade and cultural exchange, rather than conquest and exploitation, might have created more sustainable patterns of development. The Roman Empire's economy was fundamentally extractive, dependent on constant expansion to provide new sources of slaves, raw materials, and tribute. This model worked brilliantly for several centuries, but eventually reached its natural limits, contributing to the economic crises that weakened the empire in its later phases. An alternative model based on Cleopatra's approach might have emphasized trade, manufacturing, and agricultural improvement rather than conquest and exploitation. Egypt under the Ptolemies had developed sophisticated banking and credit systems, international trading networks, and agricultural techniques that sustained high population densities without environmental degradation. These innovations, if spread throughout the Mediterranean world, might have created a more stable and sustainable economic foundation for ancient civilization. The social implications of Cleopatra's defeat are equally significant. Her reign had demonstrated that women could exercise effective political authority in the ancient world, challenging traditional assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. The systematic denigration of her reputation after her death served not only Augustus's political needs, but also the broader project of restricting women's public roles in Roman society. The contrast between Cleopatra's active leadership and the passive ideal of Roman womanhood, promoted by Augustus, reveals the extent to which her defeat represented a victory for traditional patriarchal values. Roman women of the imperial period, despite their wealth and social status, were expected to remain in the background, influencing politics only through their relationships with male relatives. The independent queenship that Cleopatra had embodied became literally unthinkable in the Roman world. Yet even here, Cleopatra's example continued to inspire and challenge. Strong-willed Roman women like Livia, Julia Agrippina, and Julia Domna clearly drew inspiration from her model of active female leadership, even as they had to operate within the constraints of Roman social expectations. The recurring theme of powerful women in Roman imperial history suggests that Cleopatra's example could not be entirely suppressed, even under a system designed to limit female authority. The military innovations associated with Cleopatra's reign also had lasting consequences for the development of ancient warfare. Her use of massive warships at Actium, while ultimately unsuccessful, represented the culmination of Hellenistic naval technology. These vessels, some reportedly over 400 feet long, with multiple banks of oars and sophisticated artillery systems, were marvels of ancient engineering that would not be surpassed until the age of gunpowder. The Roman victory at Actium, however, marked the end of this tradition of naval innovation. Roman military thinking emphasized standardization and reliability over technological sophistication. The massive warships that had characterized Hellenistic naval warfare were abandoned in favor of smaller, more maneuverable vessels that required less specialized knowledge to operate and maintain. This shift from innovation to standardization reflected broader changes in ancient civilization following Cleopatra's defeat. The Roman Empire's emphasis on uniformity and central control created unprecedented stability and prosperity, but it also discouraged the kind of experimental thinking that had characterized the Hellenistic period. The loss of this innovative spirit may have delayed technological and scientific progress by centuries. The architectural legacy of Cleopatra's reign provides another window into the world that was lost with her defeat. Alexandria, under the Ptolemies, had been one of the most beautiful cities in the ancient world, combining Greek architectural principles with Egyptian decorative traditions and Roman engineering techniques. The famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood as a symbol of this successful cultural synthesis. Roman architecture, while impressive in its own right, tended toward the monumental and intimidating rather than the beautiful and harmonious. Roman buildings were designed to impress viewers with the power and authority of the state, while Ptolemaic architecture had sought to create spaces that reflected cosmic harmony and divine order. The shift from one aesthetic to the other represented a fundamental change in how political authority conceived of its relationship with its subjects. The intellectual climate of Alexandria during Cleopatra's reign was equally remarkable and equally fragile. The city's scholars and scientists worked in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom and royal patronage that encouraged bold thinking and experimental investigation. The museum and library provided resources and institutional support that allowed sustained research projects spanning decades or even centuries. This intellectual infrastructure was gradually eroded under Roman rule, not through deliberate destruction, but through neglect and changing priorities. Roman administrators were more interested in practical applications than theoretical knowledge. Royal patronage was replaced by bureaucratic funding that emphasized short-term results over long-term investigation. the community of scholars that had made Alexandria the intellectual center of the ancient world gradually dispersed to other cities or abandoned their research altogether. The loss of this intellectual community had consequences that extended far beyond Alexandria itself. Many of the scientific and mathematical insights developed by Hellenistic scholars were forgotten and had to be rediscovered centuries later by Islamic and medieval European scientists. The institutional knowledge about managing complex technological systems, conducting systematic research, and maintaining scholarly traditions was lost and had to be painfully rebuilt in later civilizations. Cleopatra's personal library, which reportedly contained works by the greatest authors and thinkers of the ancient world, was dispersed after her death. Some texts may have found their way to Rome, others to private collections throughout the empire, but many were probably lost forever. The systematic preservation of knowledge that had been a hallmark of Ptolemaic rule was replaced by the more haphazard survival patterns characteristic of the later Roman Empire. The diplomatic traditions that Cleopatra had inherited and refined were also casualties of her defeat. Ptolemaic diplomacy had been characterized by its sophistication and flexibility, its ability to maintain complex networks of alliances and trade relationships across vast distances. This diplomatic approach emphasized negotiation, cultural exchange, and mutual benefit rather than the Roman preference for ultimatums and military solutions. The replacement of Ptolemaic diplomatic methods with Roman approaches had significant consequences for international relations in the ancient world. The Romans were remarkably successful at imposing their will through military force, but they were less skilled at managing the kind of complex, multicultural relationships that characterize the Eastern Mediterranean. This limitation would eventually contribute to Rome's difficulties in dealing with Persian, Arab, and other Eastern powers. The linguistic diversity that had flourished under Ptolemaic rule also began to decline following Cleopatra's defeat. The Ptolemies had encouraged the use of multiple languages within their administration, recognizing that effective governance required communication in the languages that their subjects actually spoke. This pragmatic multilingualism had preserved and developed numerous ancient languages and literary traditions. Roman administration, while not exactly monolingual, placed much greater emphasis on Latin and Greek as languages of government and high culture. Local languages were gradually marginalized, and their literary traditions began to atrophy. The loss of linguistic diversity represented not just a cultural impoverishment, but also a loss of different ways of thinking about and understanding the world. The religious synthesis that Cleopatra had promoted also faced systematic challenges under Roman rule. While Roman religion was generally tolerant of local beliefs and practices, it increasingly emphasized the worship of the emperor and the Roman state as the highest form of religious devotion. This political use of religion was very different from the more organic syncretism that had characterized the Hellenistic period. The transformation of Egyptian religion under Roman rule illustrates these broader changes. Egyptian gods were increasingly reinterpreted in Roman terms, losing much of their specifically Egyptian character in the process. Isis became a Roman goddess rather than an Egyptian one, adapted to Roman sensibilities and stripped of many of her more challenging attributes. This process of cultural absorption was successful in spreading Egyptian religious ideas throughout the empire, but it also represented a fundamental alteration of their original meaning and significance. As we reach the end of this extended exploration of Cleopatra's life, legacy, and the world that died with her, it becomes clear that her story is far more than a tale of personal ambition and romantic intrigue. She represented a turning point in world history, a moment when ancient civilization might have developed along fundamentally different lines. Her defeat marked not just the end of Ptolemaic Egypt, but the victory of one vision of human organization over another. The Roman model that triumphed with Augustus was undeniably successful in many ways. It created unprecedented peace and prosperity, spread literacy and urban civilization throughout the Mediterranean world, and established legal and administrative traditions that influence modern governance to this day. But it was also a more rigid and hierarchical model than the one Cleopatra had represented, less tolerant of diversity, less supportive of innovation, and ultimately less sustainable over the very long term. The world we inhabit today still bears the marks of this ancient choice between different models of civilization. Our concepts of empire, our approaches to cultural diversity, our ideas about the relationship between political authority and religious belief, all have been shaped by the Roman victory over the Hellenistic alternative that Cleopatra embodied. Understanding her story and its implications helps us better understand our own world and the choices we face in organizing human society. Her personal courage and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds continue to inspire people across cultures and centuries. She faced challenges that would have broken lesser individuals. The murder of her protector, Caesar, the collapse of her alliance with Antony, the invasion of her kingdom, the capture of her person. Yet she maintained her royal bearing and her commitment to her vision until the very end. Her suicide was not an act of despair, but a final assertion of her right to control her own destiny. The persistence of fascination with Cleopatra across more than 2 millennia suggests that her story speaks to something fundamental in human nature. Perhaps it is her embodiment of the eternal struggle between individual ambition and historical forces beyond any person's control. Perhaps it is her demonstration that exceptional individuals can indeed change the course of history, even if they cannot always control the ultimate outcome. Perhaps it is simply the recognition that she was, in the words of one ancient historian, a woman of remarkable intelligence and charm who deserved a better fate than the one history granted her. In our own time, when questions of cultural identity, political leadership, and the organization of increasingly complex societies press upon us with growing urgency, Cleopatra's example offers both inspiration and sobering realism. She shows us what is possible when brilliant individuals refuse to accept the limitations of their circumstances and work to create something genuinely new. She also reminds us of the fragility of such visions and the importance of the choices we make in shaping the future. The last pharaoh of Egypt died over 2,000 years ago, but her story continues to live because it embodies eternal themes of ambition, love, power, and the endless human struggle to create meaning and beauty in the face of an often hostile universe. She was, in the end, both more and less than the legend that has grown up around her. More complex, more intelligent, more tragic than popular culture suggests, but also more human, more fallible, and more constrained by the realities of her time and place. If you've stayed with us through this comprehensive exploration of Cleopatra's rise, reign, and lasting impact on world history, I hope you've gained not just knowledge about one of history's most fascinating figures, but also insight into the complex forces that shape human civilization. Her story reminds us that history is not inevitable, that different choices might have led to very different outcomes, and that understanding the past is essential for navigating the present and future. If this deep dive into ancient history has sparked your curiosity about other remarkable figures and pivotal moments that shaped our world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. There are countless more stories of ambition, genius, and tragedy waiting to be explored. And your support helps us continue bringing these incredible tales from the past to life.